SoundCartel.
In this episode, we're delving into podcasting privacy and the law, and what you need to do to make sure you're staying on the right side of all of it with your podcast.
First of all, it's pretty poor form. I noticed the headline of this podcast is quite unique in that it's nice white parents. They're not necessarily three words that would normally go together. Maybe white parents or nice white might go together, but nice white parents, that's a bit unique. So it's clear to me that the reason they're adopting that name is to try to entice people to listen into their podcast when in fact people think they're listening to a different podcast. And that's a perfect element of misleading and deceptive conduct.
From SoundCartel, I'm Nick Schildberger, and this is Podcasting Essentials. Welcome to episode 11 of season 4. And hello again to producer and co-host Nicole Goodman.
Hey Nick, so good to be back and to talk all things policy and legal. We have two guests this episode, Nicole Stephensen and Nicole Murdoch, that are going to do just that.
And you're Nicole Goodman and I'm Nick Schildberger, so this could get a touch confusing with all the Nicks.
Yeah, it's a Nick squared episode.
Well, to make things a little bit simpler, I've left all the interviewing to you this episode.
Yes, thank you. That will be a lot less confusing for everyone involved, hopefully.
Now, it's actually quite timely that we're having this privacy and legal discussion today because just recently we've seen, unfortunately, quite a large number of pirated podcasts appearing in podcast apps.
Yeah, it seems that certain unscrupulous individuals have found and are exploiting loopholes in the anchor approval process. And they're uploading copied versions of well-known podcasts, Nick.
Yeah, it's not good at all, is it?
No.
One big example was Nice White Parents, the latest podcast from Serial and the New York Times, is appearing several times in podcast apps with the same artwork. Very cheeky of them. And the worst part about it is that the ads that these pirated podcasts are running are sending money to scammers and not the original producers of the podcasts.
Exactly. So look, if you do happen to see multiple versions of the same podcast, do make sure that you check the creator details and subscribe to the correct one.
Yes, and hopefully the powers that be will sort this out quickly and close those loopholes. But it is quite lucky that we have scheduled our legal episode today, and perhaps we should get to our first guest, Nicole Murdoch, who can help us talk through some of the implications around what's going on right at the moment.
For sure. Look, Nicole Murdoch is principal at Eaglegate Lawyers, and she specialises in technology, IP and trademark law. And I asked her what she thought about this recent piracy issue.
First of all, it's pretty poor form. I noticed the headline of this podcast is quite unique in that it's nice white parents. They're not necessarily three words that would normally go together. Maybe white parents or nice white might go together, but nice white parents, that's a bit unique. So it's clear to me that the reason they're adopting that name is to try to entice people to listen into their podcast when in fact people think they're listening to a different podcast. In our laws in Australia, it would be probably a misleading and deceptive conduct claim whereby you're saying, well, I've got enough fame in my headline. You're copying my headline, you're copying my podcast name or my title for that particular episode, and you're implying that it's the same or a connection to me when in fact there's no connection at all. So it's probably not a copyright issue in terms of title. But one of the problems we have with those claims is it can only be misleading if you're known. That's why we trademark. So trademarks don't rely on reputation. Certain claims within misleading and deceptive conduct itself rely on the reputation itself.
Okay, now here's a scenario. A creator uploads their podcast to a hosting platform, which then shares it to the publishing platforms like Apple, Spotify, Google, etc. Who owns the content?
Normally, the creator of the content owns the podcast, but that can be varied by statute, so by law or by agreement. So what is created by an employee in the course of employment is owned by the employer normally. But then, of course, you can have assignment. So we might make a deal whereby you own everything that I say. So normally it would be the one who is creating it, but you can also have joint rights. At the end of the day, if there's multiple people speaking, you're probably going to have a joint ownership of the copyright in the podcast.
So, Nicole, some hosting platforms can now create automated podcast transcripts, which sounds amazing, but they're not always 100% accurate, which could result in meaning or intention being misconstrued. Could this leave you open to legal action?
Well, again, it probably comes down to terms and conditions, but at the end of the day, you would look to sue. The first thing you would do is actually contact the host or the platform and ask them to politely correct the error, so that it's a true reflection of what was said and not an incorrect reflection. There's multiple laws you would go under, and one of them might be simply defamation. Defamation's not actually available to companies over a certain size, so sometimes if you're representing the company, you have to use different laws, such as injurious falsehood, where you would say basically they're putting a falsehood into the public, they're putting misrepresentations into the public, and that's causing us harm. And you would ask them to correct that in that respect. The Copyright Act is actually two acts in one. One is the copyright, the right to copy, and the other part of the Act actually deals with what are known as moral rights. You've got a right against mistreatment, effectively. Basically, if somebody deals with the work in an incorrect manner, you have a right to get it corrected. And again, you would look at misleading and deceptive conduct and go after the publisher. The fact that it's automated in terms of their culpability probably doesn't change too much. It may affect the way the court addresses it, but at the end of the day, if they're publishing something that's a falsehood, it doesn't really matter whether they manually created that or automatically created that. It's still a falsehood and it needs to be corrected.
Now, there's also been a couple of high-profile plagiarism cases, like We Crashed for not attributing certain content to a news source. And in 2019, Crime Junkie was called out for taking blocks of content from news articles, TV shows and other podcasts without referencing them. What's the law around referencing source material?
That's probably going to, oddly enough, depend on the jurisdiction in which it's heard, because that's probably a copyright issue at the end of the day. And we're part of what's known as the Berne Convention, and there's about 300 countries that are part of that. But as part of that convention, you get what's known as national rights in the other countries. So you get whatever treatment for a local is the same treatment you would get in that country. So it really depends on what laws would apply. So there's a bit of a misconception in Australia that we have what's known as fair use. That's actually an American term. We don't have fair use provisions in Australia at all. We have what's known as fair dealing. And it's interesting that you refer to news, because one of the fair dealings is actually reporting of the news. But it's only a fair dealing if you actually refer to a footnote or a credit. We've got 4 or 5 fair dealing provisions and each one is handled differently. So some you need to accredit your source, some you don't. But there is actually a fair dealing exception in the Copyright Act for reporting of the news. There's been a number of cases on copyright in terms of how much you can take. And it's all about how much and whether it's a substantial reproduction.
Music seems to be constantly an issue in podcasting. There are always stories of people using tracks that they shouldn't in their podcasts. Decisively, what are the rules around music usage in podcasting?
Sorry, where do I start? Look, at the end of the day, music is a musical work which is protected by copyright. And the same rules apply. The fact that it's a podcast really doesn't change a thing.
So really, unless you're prepared to pay for music, just don't use it at all.
That's exactly right. Now, there are licensing authorities where you can pay royalties, and the majority of the copyright cases we deal with are cases where somebody has downloaded an image or music from one of the free websites, believing that they're able to use it. And then they go ahead and use it, and the copyright owner says, well, hold on, you're infringing the copyright. I never gave you permission. You're not paying royalties. You need to pay up. So they're probably 80-90% of our copyright cases are on that very issue. And unfortunately, they're actually really hard to deal with in terms of the client has what we refer to as an innocent infringement defence. Innocent infringement is not a full defence. It just changes what money the other party can claim against you, but you're still infringing. I mean, if you're infringing, you're infringing. The issue is proving that the owner put the material up onto these free websites. So again, I say to the clients, always print those terms and conditions when you download this kind of material, because you want to be able to at least prove you genuinely believed you had a right to use it.
That was Nicole Murdoch, Principal at Eaglegate Lawyers. Well, it's pretty clear on music, isn't it? Don't use it unless you've got a license to do so. And when it comes to transcripts, it really is your responsibility to get it right. So make sure you do.
The onus is really on the publisher, so that's the keynote there.
Now let's move on to our talk about privacy and podcasting with Nicole Stephensen. She's the principal consultant at Ground Up Consulting and is a self-described privacy maven. She also hosts her own podcast called Privacy Matters. And Nicole, that's you, Nicole Goodman, you asked her first what privacy issues might come up for podcasters and producers.
Many podcasters are single operators, or they might work in a small business context, or perhaps they might work for, say, a not-for-profit where they're pushing particular messages out. Oftentimes, these bodies or these individuals are not going to be expressly covered by the privacy laws in the place that they're at. So, for example, here in Australia, small businesses and individuals are not expressly covered by privacy law. And small businesses are covered only when they reach a particular threshold of financial turnover every year, or in the case where they collect health information. Now, that's really interesting because what it means in practice is there's this big gap area as to whether or not privacy law expressly applies to a podcaster or the place that they're doing the podcasting from.
Then should a privacy notice or some kind of other statement about privacy be given to guests before they agree to do an interview?
Look, I think it should. So even if it's unclear whether or not you as a podcaster or the production house that you work within are covered by privacy law, your guests are going to have a fairly well bedded down expectation, right, about what you might do with their personal information. And that expectation's been created by virtue of the many different interactions that they might have with other organizations or with government. Although a law may not expressly apply in the case, what will apply is this degree of expectation management. I actually have a podcast as well called Privacy Matters that I run for an organization called the Internet of Things Security Institute. And I make a point of, in the context of that podcast, providing in my introductory specifications for the podcast to potential guests that I will need particular information from them in order to do the podcast, and I share with them how I'll handle that information over time. And it is enough, I think, to be effective in terms of managing expectations, but also to maybe get over that hurdle for some individuals that might be fearful that outside of the realm of podcasting, something could happen to their personal information that they wouldn't like.
Right. So then is record keeping an issue here? How long should the details of a guest be kept, and what details should we be keeping?
One of the things that's really important is this idea of collection minimization. And this is the notion that you only collect exactly what you need in order to do the thing you're doing, and that you don't collect anything in addition to that in terms of personal information. This is really important because the less personal information you have, the less personal information you have to worry about managing, securing, or keeping safe, or destroying eventually. So collection minimization is almost more important in this case, to my mind, than record keeping, because record keeping is what comes later. The other thing is that when you're collecting personal information, it's really important to know exactly what you need to collect and why you need to collect it. Of course, there are going to be things like an agreement of some kind that relates to the intellectual property of the individual that's coming onto the podcast. Perhaps they're sharing details of a brand new thing, a new invention or something cool or some thought leadership that's exclusively theirs and they want to retain the rights to it. Or perhaps you are concerned about what your guests might do with, say, the verbal recordings after the effect. You might have an agreement in place. If you have an agreement like that in place, of course, that's going to be the kind of thing you're going to want to file for safekeeping. That agreement will contain elements of personal information, such as the name of your guest on the show, perhaps their email address and contact phone number. as well as the fact that they've signed an agreement with you in relation to a particular thing.
That was Nicole Stephensen, Principal Consultant at Ground Up Consulting. I think the key message there, Nicole, is to play it safe. Just ask your guests for what you need. Nothing more, nothing less. And from a practical point of view, it's good advice to be upfront and clear about what you'll be doing with the information that you do collect. And don't keep things for any longer than you need to.
Yeah, it puts a lot less burden on business owners, independent podcasters as well, that they don't have to worry about too many personal details. So, yeah, really good advice from Nicole Stephensen.
Well done, Nicoles.
Oh, thank you. Thank you from us all.
Well, that's it for this episode of Podcasting Essentials. Thanks, Nicole, for joining me as always.
Thank you, Nick. Always a pleasure.
And to find out more about how we can help you create a podcast, check out our website at soundcartel.com.au or on the socials at SoundCartelAU. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're after business insights and inspiration each morning, check out our daily podcast, Business Essentials Daily, wherever you're listening now. From all of us at SoundCartel, thanks so much for listening.